There we go. Yeah. So anthropology isn't great at being condensed into very short sound bites, but I'm going to do my absolute best to just sort of run through, give you a really sort of extremely abridged version of this paper of mine. Now, this paper covered the epidemiological investigations into a suspected newly emerging infectious disease outbreak, specifically what they thought was a simian herpes B outbreak in the Brong-Ahafo region of Ghana between 2010 and 2012. So for anyone that doesn't know, that's Ghana, the bit in the red. Now, the actual focus of this paper is on how the, fairly able, reasonably well-regarded, and I like to think well-intentioned responders to the outbreak, Ghanaian and foreign, which happen to include myself, I came to believe that the source of this outbreak was this giant monkey-filled forest that, as it happens, didn't actually exist. So I think a couple of you might have already read the paper, so I'm going to try and shoehorn a little bit of new material from an upcoming paper in there too on hypothesis building to keep you on your toes. Before I do that, though, a few quick words on myself and my methods for this paper. So I'm kind of somewhere between an epidemiologist, an anthropologist, and an STS scholar, or a little bit of each. So some of the time I'm a field epidemiologist and I investigate outbreaks of unknown origin, so sort of where the causative agent is a bit unclear. I tend to do this for Médecins Sans Frontières or WHO, or occasionally just as a Cambridge researcher. And whilst I'm doing that, I just try and gather up as many primary documents whilst I'm doing my job as I can, like email chains, lab reports, try and jot down notes after every conversation and meeting, so that when the actual epidemiological work has kind of come to an end, I come back to Cambridge, I put on my sort of anthropologist hat, and I use all of these materials to create these just absolutely painfully detailed accounts of the epidemiological practices and processes that took place, so that I can kind of understand what we did and how we might do it better. The problem we come up against a lot is what we think we do and why we do it, and what we actually do and why we do it tend to be quite different things. Like our sort of imagined routines and what's going on the ground, there tends to be a bit of space in between them. So by grabbing all these primary documents from the time, I'm sort of hopefully auditing myself a little more honestly than I might otherwise. So bear with me, it was a bit of a strange outbreak and a very weird response to it, but I'm going to try and gun through the story very quickly. Towards the end of 2010, about 16 children showed up at this mission hospital in a city called Techiman in the Brong-Ahafo region. They had these really weird forms of paralysis and seizures, and the pediatrician who was running the ward, who happens to be this German nun friend of mine, was like, wow, something's weird here. This isn't sort of cerebral malaria or meningitis. This is unusual. Thankfully, the district disease control officer agreed, and he happened to know this Ghanaian virologist working in the specialist zoonoses lab down in Accra. And so he grabbed some samples, shoved them in his bag, got in an overnight bus down there, handed them to the virologist. The virologist defrosted this old multiplex PCR, ran the samples, and got this hit for B virus. Now, that was kind of big news because up until this point, B virus had only been found in East Asia and in macaques, which aren't found in Africa, and also a few very unlucky humans. So the National Surveillance Unit was like, all right, we'll send the field epidemiology team to go check it out, which is a bit like your epidemic intelligence service. It has a few vets in the mix, so they're kind of handy for these sorts of outbreaks. They did their investigation, they came back, they presented the findings to sort of all the big public health heads, like the reference laboratories, the School of Public Health and everything. In this big presentation, they explained, okay, what we think's happening is whilst the kids' parents are off farming, the monkeys are coming down from this forest that connects all the afflicted communities. The kids are playing with the monkeys, they're getting infected, and yeah, that's what's going wrong. There was a little bit of skepticism in the room, and it was decided that what they desperately needed next was confirmatory testing. So it fell to the Ghanaian virologist, who went to a US Naval Medical Research Unit called NAMRU, that's also based in Accra, to see if they could help. They sent some samples to US AMRID in the States. 6 months later, though, they still hadn't got any results, and eventually it transpired that they weren't going to get any from US AMRID. During this time, the public health response had sort of dissipated, but some research coalitions had formed, including one headed by this American naval officer and including some Cambridge researchers such as myself, and the original doctor and the Ghanaian virologist. And thankfully, some people from Georgia State, which has a simian herpes reference laboratory. And they were able to finally do the confirmatory testing, which said, no, it isn't B virus, but it could be something else. So then all of the research proposals and all of our work started to consider other pathogens in potentially other animals living in the forest. 2 years later, life sort of happens. None of these research proposals ever really materialized, ethics approvals, secondments, all of that sort of jazz. And sometime in sort of 2012, I think we could say it was sort of over. And so we hadn't got any clarity really on what had happened then. We'd had no public health interventions at all. It had just sort of, as the Ghanaian said, it had died a natural death. Can't really go into this, but needless to say, there isn't a forest. These little black triangles, they're the original 16 cases. And as you can see, there's no big forest connecting them. There are little bits of patches of forest here and there, but nothing sort of all-encompassing. And also, it's a huge geographic area. Also, about a third of the cases came from Techiman, which is where I was living at the time. And the place does not have monkeys and it barely has trees. It's just this giant industrial, pretty barren city. Now, this isn't the first time we've had this sort of anomalous environmental backdrop of zoonotic emergence story get a foothold amongst scientists such as ourselves. The cut-hunter hypothesis, that was very quickly dismantled by French and African historians who were like, what? No, get out of here with that. But it still got quite a bit of traction amongst virologists in particular. With the 2014 Ebola outbreak, very early on, we were hearing about how deforestation in Guinea had primed the area for Ebola spillover by disrupting the bat populations. But some anthropologists that lived there and were quite familiar with the area for a few decades were like, I don't think that's right. If anything, I think they've been cultivating forest. And they were able to find some old satellite images which might support this idea. So I thought it was kind of important that, especially as I'd gathered up all these materials whilst working on this investigation, to try and understand how it is that myself and my colleagues came to believe in a giant monkey-filled forest that didn't exist, because these aren't sort of incidental backdrops. They tell us how reasonable the other components of the explanatory tableaus are. The animals we're implicating, the routes of transmission, the points of intervention or prevention. And also it sort of precludes other possible explanations when we sell each other on these particular settings. So I gave myself kind of 3 tasks because I didn't want to get too caught up in the sort of novelty of how we believed in invisible monkeys. The first was just to try and work out where this idea of a forest came from, like who came up with that and where were we getting it from? The second was to try and work out to what extent my colleagues genuinely believed there'd been a forest. And the third bit, not to go down the anthropology track too heavily, but in the anthropology of rumors, when you're trying to understand a rumor, the most important question to ask yourself is, what made that story that damn good to tell for that group of people? And so I'll try and do that. Very quickly, constructing the forest. So where did this come from? As I said before, I create these really tediously detailed accounts of the epidemiological sense-making that's going on. So this is a simplified version of the Brong-Ahafo region outbreak. Now, each one of those colors is one of us involved in the response, or a little group. And when they're sitting next to each other, that's where we've shared some information. And so you can kind of see it over time. Now, if we just go to the bits where there's mention of a forest belt, you can see that just next to that A, that's where it started. And then we all just absolutely ran with it. It was every message we sent involved it. So that little juncture there, that was the field epidemiology team's investigation. So it turned out, because of resource constraints and school constraints and all the rest, they only went for 3 days and were only able to talk to the parents of 3 of the affected children. They also had in their head that this was a laboratory confirmed outbreak of B virus. So really, they were just looking for monkeys, So they just got really unlucky or unlucky, depending how you think about it. And one of the parents of one of the kids they spoke to when they were pushing him on the monkey topic was like, you know what? A couple of decades ago, I think I did see a monkey on my farm. And it just so happened there was a clump of trees at the edge of that village. And they're like, oh, job done. Okay, we've got the monkeys. They're in the trees. The trees probably connect all the affected communities that we haven't actually visited. there's our explanation for the outbreak. So the way I work out who's spreading these things is through interviews, primary documents, email chains, all the rest. But also it was quite easy with this one because everyone had their very particular designations for how they were describing the forest. So the field epidemiology team kept referring to it as a forest belt. The pediatrician kept referring to it as a forest area along the Techiman-Katampa Road. And there were a few other sort of signifiers. And over time, people sort of co-opted each other's language, even if they didn't know the people who'd originally come up with it. And yeah, so the reason why everyone was referring to it in different ways was because we were all, it turns out, imagining completely different forests. Despite one person inventing the idea of forest, we were all like dead set convinced of our own forests with very different geographies. And the reason we had different forests was because we were all sort of implicating different populations of monkeys. So the field epidemiology team thought that the monkeys must be coming from this Mona and Colobus sanctuary way off to the east. So their forest belt is like a third of Ghana. The district disease control officer thought that it was baboons. And so his is the yellow forest belt. And it goes all the way to the north of Ghana in the Mole National Park. The pediatrician had spoken to the rangers at the sanctuary, and they were like, no, all of our monkeys are present and accounted for, like not causing outbreaks over with you guys. And so she was like, it's not the colobus. The forest must be along the road where the cases are coming from, which, you know, if you think about it, is also the catchment area for the hospital. Now, although we were all sort of really fighting it out over the monkey species we should be investigating, like you should see the track changes on some of our research proposals. Like just, what? No, obviously not olive baboons. What are you talking about? They have like herpes pup. It was really quite detailed and extensive. At no point did any of us seem to twig that we'd actually imagined completely different forests. That just sort of slipped by. So to what extent did any of us believe there was a forest? Well, first up, you can stand in the middle of a city and have absolutely no clue what the larger landscape is like 5 minutes away from you. The Brong-Ahafo region is a really varied sort of ecological mixed area. It's feasible that there was a giant forest just out of our sort of sight. The other thing is you probably all realize in zoonotic research, we tend to infer contact. We don't actually see the pangolin sneeze on the little kid or the fruit bat drop that half-eaten, I don't know, apple onto the gorilla that eats it, and then we see someone eat the gorilla. We just kind of allow that the sort of spatial overlap, and that's enough. Now, where I felt things had actually breached the allowances for epidemiological imagination, though, and remember, when I'm doing this work, I'm in epidemiologist mode, so not anthropologist mode, so this stuff isn't very sophisticated. But I thought, how is it possible we have a third of our cases coming from this like demonstrably monkey-free barren city? And yet we're saying it's coming from a forest. So I sort of confronted the field epidemiology team with this, and they were immediately like, you know what, maybe the sick kids in the city, like maybe they're not real cases. You know, we said our case definitions quite wide, you get a bit of a mixed bag. And so to them, they were just some aberrant data points that could be wiped out of the narrative. The pediatrician and I, and remembering she's a nun, this is going to sound particularly dodgy. We really got into it at a pub one night with her like drawing this forest on the back of a napkin and me being like, no, because like we've got half our cases here. And she was like, oh yeah. And so despite being absolutely convinced that she knew where this forest was, when confronted with these kind of incompatible bits of evidence, it did sort of shake her doubt. So I think the best way we can answer this question is to say, if we thought about it, we knew it didn't fit together, but we never really thought about it that hard. And also something I see in other outbreak investigations is we really privilege laboratory diagnostics in epidemiology, like far more than we should a lot of the time, to the point where it begins to distort our ability to handle other types of evidence and build the narrative up accordingly. So anyway, that's my very rushed answer to that one. So finally, why a forest? Well, the answer is there's just a wealth of fiction and non-fiction telling us if there's a zoonotic outbreak in Africa, well, there's a forest. Yeah, if you hear the accounts of the Brong-Ahafo region outbreak that we were putting into our draft manuscripts and our sort of slides and our research proposals, it sounds just like the emergence of HIV or simian foamy virus or Marburg. The way Techiman is depicted, it looks a lot more like the way the CDC described rural Guinea during the Ebola outbreak than it does actual tetramer. There were some other components to this narrative too about, oh, maybe the locals are lying to us about interacting with monkeys because they're superstitious and all this other awfulness, which also I think tells you that these are not just us being inculcated into images of zoonotic emergence in Africa, but just a colonial vision of Africa as a whole. I realize I'm probably pushing my time here, so I'm going to just stop there. The paper is here if you'd like to read it. I've got a similar one, not a similar one on specifically hypothesis building in relation to this outbreak coming out next month, if you're interested more in how scientific theories are built. My quick thanks though, I just wanted to say, to be able to do the kind of work I do, I not only need my colleagues to let me do this, I need them to actually, support me in doing it, to hand over the documents, to answer honestly the questions. And then they all know that I end up writing this up, our greatest professional failings, telling absolutely everyone about it, again, in all this detail. Like, it's very easy to work out who the German pediatrician nun is, who, Professor Wood is, who I am, and all the rest, and our role in all of this. And the reason they let me, shame us all publicly this way is because they're genuinely committed to doing what we do better. And so if anyone wants to talk to me about how you can bring this sort of reflective angle into your own work, feel free to shoot me an email afterwards. So that's it. I'll stop now.